Our story today is found in the book of 2 Kings chapter 5. Let's dive right in and begin reading from verse 1. Now Naaman was commander of the king of Aram's army. He was highly respected and esteemed by his master, because through him Adonai had brought victory to Aram. But although he was a brave warrior, he suffered from leprosy. So here we are introduced to the first character in our story, a man named Naaman. And right off the bat, we're told quite a few things about him, which we're now going to unpack. First, on the description list, we're told Naaman is the commander of the king's army. So he is the general, if you will. Now right away, something here may stand out to us as readers today, but it most certainly would have stood out to an Israelite. Because we're told that Naaman is not just the commander of any army, he's the commander of the army of the king of Aram. Now Aram is located northeast of Palestine in what is present-day Syria. And in those days, the Arameans were bitter enemies of the Israelites. And so when an Israelite hears this story, and it begins by describing a man who is the leader of the Aramean army, the army that fights against Israel, as highly respected and esteemed, this would jump off the page. But the Israelite reader might say, well, the text says he was highly respected by his master, the king of Aram. That's perhaps not so surprising after all. I mean, they are on the same team. But then the second shocker hits. Number 4 on the list of descriptors states that through Naaman, Adonai, the Lord, the God of Israel, had brought victory to Aram. Our God bringing victory through an Aramean and bringing victory to Aram? And then comes the 5th descriptor. On top of it all, the text goes on to describe this Naaman as a brave warrior. That's quite a list of praise, of honorable words used to describe a Gentile, an enemy, and a heathen. And finally, at the end of this list it says, but although he was a brave warrior, he suffered from leprosy. Now leprosy was a disease well known in Israel in those days. It was a disease which in the later stages ended up turning one's skin snow white. It was deadly, infectious, and associated with ceremonial uncleanness. In other words, not just physical uncleanness, but spiritual and moral uncleanness. When a person was seen to have leprosy, an Israelite would wonder, what terrible sin have they committed to have deserved such an end? Leprosy was thought of as not a mere physical illness, but an outward sign of inner corruption. And so when the Israelite reader arrives at this final piece of Naaman's character description, they might exclaim, finally, that's more like it. Well, of course he has leprosy. He's a Gentile, ungodly, an enemy of Israel and of God, all grounds for inner uncleanness. Of course he's cursed with the unclean disease. This story really had me wondering there for a second, but now everything is beginning to make sense again. But did you notice something about the mention of Naaman's leprosy? Naaman's leprosy is only mentioned at the very end of his description. Now, usually having leprosy in those days would be the first defining piece of information about a person. It would be the characteristic they'd be introduced by. The ill wouldn't even have a name anymore. They'd just be the leper or the unclean. This is demonstrated in that if they ventured into populated areas, they'd have to announce themselves by calling out, "Unclean, unclean," as they walked along, to warn people to keep their distance. Being unclean was literally the first thing a leper was identified as in Israel. But in introducing Naaman, a Gentile, he is announced foremost by all these praiseworthy attributes. And only at the very end of the list are we told, oh, and by the way, he suffered from leprosy. Now, to an Israelite audience, this story is already pretty strange, and it's about to get stranger. Let's continue reading from verse 2. Now, on one of their raids into Israel's territory, Aram captured and carried away a little girl, who became a servant for Naaman's wife. So the Aramean army is performing an assault on Israelite land, and in the process they kidnap and steal away a prisoner of war, an Israelite girl who is then made a servant, a slave, in Naaman's household. Verse 3, she, that is the girl, said to her mistress, I wish my master would go and see the prophet who is in Samaria. He could heal him of his leprosy. Hold on. So this girl is stolen from her family, her home, everything she knows, is kidnapped by the enemy and condemned to work in the house of an enemy for the rest of her life. And here she's showing concern and care for her oppressor, the leader of the very army that captured her, and going so far as to wish that Naaman would see an Israelite prophet who could heal him of his leprosy. What a remarkable girl. This servant is giving something undeserved, giving something for free. Verse 4. Naaman went to his master, that is the king, and told him what the girl from Israel had said. By all means go, the king of Aram replied. I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. Naaman tells the king of Aram about what the servant girl had said, and the king, who we've already been told highly values Naaman, says, yes, of course. Go, try to get help in Israel. In fact, I'll write an official letter to Israel's king for you to take with you, so you'll be received and treated well and given access to this prophet in Samaria. And Naaman brings with him silver, gold, and clothes, a lot of it. The worth of the gold alone would today be the equivalent of about 174,000 British pounds. Why is Naaman bringing with him so much treasure? Well, you don't get healed for nothing. If Naaman was going to be helped, healed from his disease, he expects to have to pay for it, because Naaman knows very well that in this world, nothing good comes for free. Verse 6. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, with this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy. As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, Am I God? Can I bring death and bring back to life? Why does this man send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a fight with me? Israel's king is not happy about his Amazon delivery that day. In fact, as he reads the letter and sees Naaman standing before him, he tears his robes, a cultural act which expressed great grief or anguish. And he says, I am not God. I can't bring life to someone already dead. Why is the king of Aram asking of me something I cannot do? Why is he picking a fight with me? By his reaction, we are shown what the king sees when he looks at Naaman. He sees an impossibility. Not an opportunity to help, not a chance to do some good. He sees political games. Not the chance for a foreigner to experience the power of Israel's God. The king thinks, of course I can't heal Naaman. Who can heal a condemned man of an unclean disease, which is already a death sentence? How can we make a clean man who is by default unclean because he is a Gentile? And then when Naaman goes back home unhealed, the king of Aram will use this as an excuse to attack us in full-out war. Verse 8. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message. Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. Here we meet a new character in the story, a man named Elisha. If you remember, a few weeks ago at Shabbat at the house, we looked at the story of Elijah, the prophet, in the Museum of Horeb. And you might recall that God, in response to Elijah's exhaustion, tells him that he is to go and choose a man called Elisha to be his successor, to be the one to take over for him as prophet in Israel. Well, this is Elijah's successor, a man named Elisha. And this is the prophet in Samaria, which the Israelite girls spoke of. So when Elisha hears about the king's reaction to the visitors from Aram, he sends a message to the king, because his focus is different from the king's focus. He says, "Why are you upset? This isn't about playing political games. You've missed what this is really about. Send Naaman to me." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Now, here is a noteworthy detail. In quite a remarkable show of respect, Naaman doesn't enter the house of Elisha. Why is this a show of respect? Because Naaman was no doubt more than familiar with some of the Israelite ceremonial laws. They stipulate that if a Gentile enters an Israelite's house, then everyone in that household becomes unclean. And in the case of Naaman, who is a leper, he would be considered doubly unclean because of his disease. So even though he is an army's commander and has with him a whole host of servants and horsemen and chariots, he stops and waits outside Elisha's house out of respect. Verse 10. Elisha sent a messenger to him who said, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your skin will be restored, and you will be clean." But Naaman became angry and left, saying, "I thought for certain that he would come out personally, that he would stand, call on the name of Adonai his God, and wave his hand over the diseased spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned away and went off in a rage. Once Naaman's arrived at the prophet's house, he hasn't received the welcome he expected, nor the help he'd hoped for. For one, he expected that Elisha himself would come out to meet him, wave his hand around a bit, say the magic words, and heal him. But here the prophet seems almost aloof. He sends out a messenger instead, and the messenger tells him to go have a bath in the river Jordan. Now, Jordan was a river in Israel. You can see it here on the map. It ran southward, and its waters ended up in the Dead Sea. But upon being asked to go bathe in it, Naaman replies, "Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Now Abana and Pharpar were two rivers in the country of Aram, flowing near the capital city of Damascus in Naaman's homeland. At first glance, Naaman's comment may seem like a vain boast about the superiority of his own country, but there are a few things here to consider. Number one, the Arameans believed in river gods. They believed that gods lived in the rivers of Abana and Pharpar, making them, therefore, holy waters. Secondly, if we take another look at the map here, Abana and Pharpar were north of the Jordan. In fact, the same waters of Abana and Pharpar ran down into the Sea of Galilee, then into the Jordan River, and finally ended up in the Dead Sea. And if you know anything about water and water sources, you know that the freshest, cleanest water can be found further upstream. The higher up you go, the closer to the source you get, the cleaner the water is. And the further down the stream you go and the closer to the ocean you get, the dirtier the water gets. And so the waters of Abana and Pharpar up north were known for their clear, clean waters. People in that region thought of them as healing. While the Jordan River, even today, is often muddy, brown, and sluggish. It is described as having a clay color. Even the Hebrew word Jordan means to flow down or descend. The Jordan is not some sparkly, clear, bottled water you'd prefer to bathe in. It is the muddy brown river towards the end of the river's flow. So perhaps now we can better understand why Naaman is upset. He has this disease which the Israelites refer to as unclean. Then this Israelite prophet tells him he needs a bath, like he's some dirty foreigner who just forgot to have enough showers. And then he tells him not just to have one bath, but 7. How dirty do you think I am, Elisha? And then Elisha has the audacity to say that he should bathe in the Jordan of all places, the brown, dirtier waters of the Jordan River, when there is the much superior rivers back home in Aram. And Naaman quite understandably walks off in a rage. Verse 13. But Naaman's servants approached him and said, "My father, if the prophet had asked you to do something really difficult, wouldn't you have done it? So doesn't it make even more sense to do what he says when it's only bathe and be clean?" Naaman's servants who have come with him on his journey follow after him and say, if the prophet had given you some really great challenge or task to do, you would have done it. After all, Naaman has been described as a brave warrior and a military commander. But now Elisha's given you something easy to do. Why not just do it? Why not just bathe in the Jordan like he says? What do you have to lose? It wouldn't be the first time in our story that Naaman is helped by remarkable servants. Servants that are willing to stick out their necks to approach their angry master, to reason with him if it means he might be cured. Verse 14. So he went down and immersed himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And his skin was restored, and became like the skin of a child, and he became clean. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant." Naaman's reaction to being healed is pretty astounding. This time Naaman comes to the prophet's house, Elisha himself comes out to meet him. And Naaman doesn't just thank Elisha, he says, "I now believe. I know that your God is the only God in the world." And the Aramean commander says, "Here, accept these gifts I've brought for you as gratitude for my healing." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. Though Naaman insists and urges Elisha to accept his gifts again and again, Elisha says, "No, I will not." What is the reason for Elisha's refusal? Is he being coy? Is he being humble? Is he a minimalist refusing material goods? If we look at Naaman's response to being healed, there's more than one change, more than one thing that has happened to him. Because not only is his leprosy gone, he has also gained faith in Israel's God. He has been healed by God. And in the Israelite mind, this is more than a skin-deep healing. After all, if we remember, leprosy was considered an outward sign of inner corruption. And if that is the case, then the healing of that outward illness would be viewed as a sign of forgiveness, a healing of an inward uncleanness. In other words, being healed of leprosy was considered in the land of Israel as a sign of acceptance from God, reconciliation to God. Naaman not only lost his leprosy that day, he gained a relationship with God. And if you know anything about the God of Israel, you'll know that whatever he gives for free. His forgiveness is free, his healing is free, his help is free. It doesn't come with a price tag. And Elisha knew this. He knew, number one, that any healing didn't come from himself, but from God. And then number two, this was a free gift. If Elisha was now to accept these expensive gifts from Naaman, what would he be saying? What would he be communicating to the Aramean commander? That God's forgiveness or healing or acceptance costs something. That we can buy it somehow or earn it somehow. And so he says, "No, thank you. I won't take these things from you." And Naaman replies, "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry. For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." Naaman makes two requests of Elisha. Firstly, he asks if he can bring back to Aram with him earth from Israel. Now this stems from the belief in those days that the land of a city or country would be seen as belonging to, being consecrated to, the God of that people, belonging to the God the people of that land served. And so Naaman, having been brought up with this understanding, is expressing the wish to worship the God of Israel when he gets home. But his belief stipulates that he cannot worship Yahweh on earth, on ground, sanctified in honor of the Aramean gods. And so he wants to bring back earth from Israel on which he can stand on and rightly worship Yahweh. Secondly, Naaman requests, Please, I ask that Adonai, the Lord of Israel, forgives me for what I have to do when I get home." Because when Naaman gets home, a part of his service to the king of Aram is to go with the king to the temple of Rimmon. Now, Rimmon was the national god, the head god of the Arameans, and Naaman would be expected to accompany the king to Rimmon's temple, to offer his arm as support for the king, and to bow down before Rimmon in that temple. Here Naaman is saying, "Please may God forgive me for this. I don't mean this as an act of worship, because I now believe only Yahweh is God on earth. But I don't know how to get around my royal duties as the army general." Although Naaman's faith may have changed, his whole world back home hadn't. Now, some Israelites, upon hearing this, would say, "Well, your leprosy is going to return to you. You may be so-called converted, but when you get home, you won't be living as a good Israelite should. Surely, Naaman, your uncleanness will remain." But Elisha doesn't respond in that way. Instead, he receives Naaman, accepts him for the situation he's in, accepts him for where he is on his journey, and God's prophet's response is, "Go in peace," Elisha said. What an interesting story, and one which would be most surprising to a Hebrew audience. God healing a foreigner, healing a Gentile, a sinner, and then making room for him, accommodating, accepting him, despite not being an Israelite, despite him not living as a perfect Israelite, as he ought to after gaining faith in God. Most Israelites would have said, "Well, you've been forgiven. Now you need to change your ways." Can we find this sort of thinking or similar sentiments in our context today? Many Christians today would have said to Naaman, "You now believe in God, you have been baptized. Well, if you want to keep on being accepted by God, keep on being saved, then you need to start living a clean life. You need to live purely, change all your ways. Otherwise, your old uncleanness, your old illness will return." But isn't it interesting how in this story, a perfect God is meeting Naaman where he is? God meets Naaman where he is on his journey, on his imperfect journey. He sees Naaman as trying to honor God, trying to worship God in whatever way he can. He tries to respond with gratitude, tries to have a relationship, and in response, God meets him where he is. And God's prophet wishes Naaman peace. Well, this extraordinary story isn't over quite yet. End of verse 19. After Naaman had traveled some distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, "My master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, by not accepting from him what he brought. As surely as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him." So Gehazi hurried after Naaman. When Naaman saw him running toward him, he got down from the chariot to meet him. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Everything is all right," Gehazi answered. "My master sent me to say, 2 young men from the company of the prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing." "By all means, take 2 talents," said Naaman. He urged Gehazi to accept them, and then tied up the 2 talents of silver in 2 bags, with 2 sets of clothing. He gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them ahead of Gehazi. When Gehazi came to the hill, He took the things from the servants and put them away in the house. He sent the men away, and they left. When he went in and stood before his master, Elisha asked him, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" "Your servant didn't go anywhere," Gehazi answered. But Elisha said to him, "Was not my heart with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money, or to accept clothes, or olive groves and vineyards, or flocks and herds, or male and female slaves?" Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever. Then Gehazi went from Elisha's presence, and his skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. The story of Naaman's healing orbits two big, important ideas. Number one, servanthood, and number two, cleanness and uncleanness. Let's first take a look at the first idea, servanthood. Throughout this story, we meet different kinds of servants. The little girl, Naaman's servants, Gehazi, and even Elisha being a servant of God. On the one hand, we have servants who give more than is perhaps deserved, who show grace, who show bravery, who help. And on the other hand, we meet a servant who completely misses the point, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha. Gehazi looked at this situation, the healing of Naaman the Aramean, in a different way than his master did. Gehazi looked at Naaman and thought, "My master went too easy on him. His healing was too easy, too cheap, too painless. I know who Naaman is. He is an enemy. He is a Gentile. He is a sinner. He has done wrong. He shouldn't get away with a free gift like that. He shouldn't be let off the hook so easily. I will go get something from him." Now, Gehazi's actions may seem to some readers as unimportant. After all, Naaman clearly had money. He could afford to part with a couple of outfits. It would be no skin off his back. Why would Gehazi, accepting a gift, which Naaman already insisted on giving, be such a big deal? Why did Elisha react in the way he did to Gehazi's actions? Well, as we said, Elisha not accepting money or gifts from Naaman delivered an important message, an important statement which would color Naaman's experience with Israel's God. And that message was, what God gives, he gives for free. God's gifts don't need to be bought, and his kindness has no price. Which is proved in a glaringly ironic way in Naaman being asked to bathe in a brown-watered river. This act, this request of Naaman, was to underline, to spell with big letters in the sky, it's not your bathing, your actions, the magic in any particular waters that is going to heal you, Naaman. Dunking yourself in the Jordan is a symbolic act, an act where you signify your consent to be healed, an act where you're simply signaling your consent and acceptance of God's free gift. Because unlike what we're used to, some things in this world do come for free. But Gehazi, by running after Naaman, by accepting in essence payment, you have sullied that message. Gehazi, you have clouded that truth. Now, on the other hand, some of us may look at Gehazi with disgust. We may see a man acting out of greed, a greedy servant who saw a chance to make some money off helping a sick person. But Gehazi's thinking may not be so far off from the thinking that flourishes and finds root in our churches. Because if you look at the text, Gehazi's reasoning for going after Naaman wasn't, "I want some new clothes," or "I want some more money." Verse 20, Gehazi said to himself, "My master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, by not accepting from him what he brought." The root of Gehazi's thinking was, Naaman should have to pay something for what he received. Naaman's healing was too cheap. He shouldn't have been helped for nothing. Are we sometimes in danger of thinking this way too? Sure, we might think about God's forgiveness as being free. We might talk about his acceptance in sermons, or recite over and over again that salvation comes because of God's grace, his free grace, and cannot be earned in any way. But when it comes down to dealing with actual, real, living people, people that we may not like, people that we may disagree with, people we measure against our own righteousness scale, does perhaps the word free begin to wane a little? Is it possible that we too think of some of those around us as they are receiving salvation too cheaply? They are being allowed to exist in this church too easily. They are being accepted among us at too low a cost. Sometimes I think there's this phenomenon which happens where a person is baptized, and leading up to their baptism, the message they're given by other believers is, "Come as you are. God's forgiveness is always available to you. His arms are open wide." But then there's a switch that happens. A post-baptism bar is set, where the baptized person is then expected, slowly but surely, to begin jumping through hoops, or perhaps is expected to begin to earn their place in that faith community by dressing, eating, speaking in a certain way. And even though the baptized person needs just as much forgiveness and grace and patience post-baptism as they did before, that message of grace can come to be replaced by rigid expectation and a bullying, sometimes an unspoken, status quo, and a message of free salvation that now has hidden charges. Yes, salvation is still free, but read the small writing. You need to do this and this and this to continue to earn it, to continue to be in it, or else your leprosy will return to you. Now, this is not to say that being in a relationship with God is a journey without taking personal responsibility, without the need to take accountability, that things like how we treat others doesn't matter, or that social justice is made trivial. Quite on the contrary. But we can end up making the same mistake as Gehazi. We can start unrightfully regulating who gets to be healed, who gets to come close to God. If it is easier to get into the kingdom of God than it is to get into a church, that should be a red flag for us. If it is easier to be accepted by the God of the universe than it is to be accepted by those who call themselves followers of him, then that should be a huge red flag to us. A sign that we have created taxation on a free gift and are adding on costs to his free grace. This can be done so subtly, in between the lines, so covertly that we may even miss that we're doing it. But by doing it, we are being poor messengers. And by doing it, we are also setting ourselves up as a higher authority than God himself. And here is where we touch on servanthood. Because in this story, the one servant who is policing the free gifts of God is the one who is the bad servant. When it comes to serving God, this is what bad servanthood looks like. Guarding a door which God said he's opened, free to all. A door which no man can shut. And this is where we discover that these two big ideas in the story of Naaman, servanthood and cleanness and uncleanness, are intrinsically linked. This whole story is about two types of servants, clean and unclean servants. Gehazi saw Naaman as an unclean Gentile and therefore concluded that he shouldn't get to receive God's grace for free. But it would seem that God has a very different idea, a deeper idea, about what it means to truly be clean or unclean. And it doesn't have to do with bathing or the country you're born in, and it's more than skin deep. A servant was meant to represent their master, to carry out their master's wishes and deliver their messages. So what does it mean to be a good servant of God in this world? Being a good servant, a clean servant, means representing God's goodness and free grace to the world. This is what it means to have an allegiance to him. A good servant doesn't try to get in the way of what his or her master is doing. And if God, the master, insists on giving extravagant compassion and healing and salvation even to those we might consider ineligible for such gifts, well, then who are we to send them a bill or refuse them or refuse to deliver that message? When we send the message, through our actions or words, as Elisha did to Naaman, that God's gifts are truly free and we needn't earn his kindness, then we become good representatives and we truly serve God faithfully. We become good servants with a clean purpose and an unsullied message. But we do not serve God when we misrepresent his free gift to the people around us. Then we become like Gehazi, who runs after the people God has sent away in peace, and we contort the message of God. And in this misrepresentation, true uncleanness lies there. It is here that true inner corruption reveals itself. This is the challenge for us today, for anyone who wishes to share that God is good and kind and there to help. Let us not pollute his beautiful message. Let us cast off the urge to become bouncers at a door that was meant to be freely accessed by anyone who would like to enter it. Let us shed the arrogance of assuming we serve God well by guarding a gift he freely gives to all, or policing a kingdom which is and will be peopled by those often considered by us as dirty and unacceptable. Is Gehazi's uncleanness a corruption which we need forgiveness from today, which we ourselves need healing from? Well, if it is, there's good news, because I happen to know a God who helps for free.